Hello and welcome to the first ever Pigskin podcast. I'm Jonathon Bruner.
And I'm Jenna Lifshen.
And this is the first time ever that the Kentucky Kernel has had some podcast interaction with a special section. And if you've read the story that goes with this one, you know exactly what we're talking about today. We're talking about Kentucky football in 2025, what's been good and what's been bad. Jumping right into the conversation here, Kentucky football in 2025 has been a mixed bag. There's been a lot of different things going on. Let's start off with what's been good so far about Kentucky football. I think one of the biggest points and one of the biggest focal points of the offseason was the big blue wall, this offensive line.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at how unsuccessful last season was, obviously it was a mix of a bunch of things. You know, it was a recipe for disaster, but the biggest part being that big blue wall or the offensive line. They just couldn't give, Brock Vandegrift really any time, and it was just a flaw they had. They couldn't get the run game going, but This year, it was probably the first thing I noticed about this new Kentucky team. They were so successful in the offseason getting transfers for that line, and now they have a lot of older, more experienced players, and it's benefiting Kentucky a lot, especially with how, much unknowns there are when it comes to even who QB1 is.
Exactly.
But then, the other thing with the wide receivers not really knowing who's going to be that guy yet. The past few seasons, it's very obvious who it's been. You had the Dankes and the Berry and Browns, but this season, you're still kind of waiting to see who it's going to be. But that offensive line is giving them time. It's giving them, the space to try and figure things out. And, of course, it's opening amazing holes for, the running backs to get in some really good plays.
Yeah, of course. And, the offensive line it's been a staple of Mark Stoops. So
Absolutely.
Seeing it last year just be absolutely abysmal, just to put it frankly, just how it was, sent Brock Vandegrift into retirement. That kind of thing, that's not something you see every day with an offensive line. And truly, the turnaround has been a bit remarkable. Everyone saw how well it played against Toledo and then was kind of like, okay, let's see.
It's Toledo.
Let's see about when Ole Miss comes to town, and then we can have the conversation. But they held strong against Ole Miss. They got to Zach Calzada a couple times. Mm-hmm. But then besides that, it really flowed really well. There was not a whole lot that was missing from the offensive line. And like you mentioned before, they've been able to open holes for what has been a really, really stellar run game so far.
Yeah, absolutely, JB. I think, last season we didn't see the run game as much just because the option wasn't really there. There wasn't really anywhere for them to go. This year, there's been a lot of options. We've seen a lot of players really take advantage of it, and I think Kentucky needs it bad. When they're still unsure of who their wideout options are, when the quarterback's still struggling to kind of find his momentum, no matter, if it's Cutter Boley or Zach Calzada, they need to have that run game going because there has to be offense. You can have the best defense in the world, but if your offense can't score, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's really been the only thing keeping this offense afloat. And last year, kind of, Chip Trayanum was supposed to be the guy. Mm-hmm. Under Mark Stoops, there's always the guy. You've had Chris Rodriguez, Benny Snell, Ray Davis.
Absolutely.
I mean, you name it. Just a laundry list of just great players under Mark Stoops, the running back position. It's been a position he's had no problem recruiting throughout his tenure here at Kentucky. And, the run game has really been a two-head snake this year, which is not something that you see a lot at Kentucky. Normally, like we just said, it's one
guy
leading the charge, one-man show, putting on a show every Saturday. But this year, it's really been a kind of a split load between two guys.
Yeah, absolutely. We got Seth McGowan, and then you have Dante Dowdle. Both have been incredible. And, I think the benefit of the transfer portal is sometimes you're not going to have to train, a freshman from day one. The running back position is one that really comes with experience, I feel like, where it just takes the reps. And with older guys, they can see, those openings better. They can see the holes. And when you have like McGowan, he's done so well throughout the season and he has that experience under his belt, I think it's benefited Kentucky a lot. But, we also look at the other line, the defensive line. That's also been, one of the best parts of Kentucky football this season.
Yeah, and that was one of the biggest unknowns of the team because, you lose Deion Walker, and then you kind of look at it on paper coming into the year, and typically, a Mark Stoops off a defensive line is known for just a massive guy up front, just bully that can just run you over like Deion Walker. It was just a bully up there. He was bigger than you, stronger than you, not a whole lot you could have done. This year, it's been more of kind of like a shifty approach, kind of guys that aren't as big as the offensive linemen, guys that are a little more reliant on their speed to get past the offensive linemen, and so far, so good.
Absolutely. I think defensive wise, I think Kentucky is one of the best in the SEC that I've seen. I mean, that Ole Miss game, even though Kentucky ended up losing, I don't think that defense could have played a better game. This is an Ole Miss offense that people talked about was one of the most fast-paced, really strong ones in the country. They're very fast-moving. They have all these options on the wideouts, and they were stopping them, and they were forcing these throws. You have Ty Bryant, who, had those 2 interceptions in one quarter. And then going back to Toledo, you have Steven Souls, who, he's in his second year, starting to take over as kind of a leader and a veteran. And, when losing so many guys on the defense in the offseason, you got to have the younger guys step up. He had 2 sacks in the first game. Even though it's against Toledo, it doesn't matter. Yeah. That's still sacks. He's forcing fumbles. The defense as a whole unit is really put together, and it feels like they've been playing together for a really long time, which in this NIL era and transfer portal era, you don't really see that often.
Right, and that's the thing. They kind of passed their first SEC test. The next 5 opponents that Kentucky plays in the SEC are all ranked as of week 3. Coming into week 3, they're all ranked. Auburn wasn't originally, but they've snuck in there. So now it's kind of one of those things where it's going to become really a real true test to see where this defense goes from here. But speaking of the defense, that's going to kind of segue us into what's not so good about Kentucky. And I think there's a certain element of the defense, while it as a whole has been very productive and very good, there's one glaring thing that's sticking out so far that has actually kind of really jaded their statistics and jaded their numbers, because currently they're last in the SEC in points per game given up. And that is explosive plays.
Yeah.
Ole Miss was known for it, knew it was coming with Ole Miss, and they exploited it. For those that don't know, an explosive play is any play 20 yards or more. Anytime there's a 20-yard gain or more, that is considered an explosive play. Ole Miss went for 7 of those on this Kentucky defense.
I think, as many experienced players as the defense has, there's still a lot of young guys. And when you kind of look at the secondary, it gets a little younger, and when you're having a bunch of guys testing out these positions for the first time, playing against an Ole Miss team is really tough, because you can predict that they're going to have those explosive plays, but you don't exactly know how, when, and where they're going to come. And, I think one of the biggest problems that even players were talking about after the game is those first tackles. A lot of missed first tackles, which, it kills momentum. It's really hard on a team, because it's literally will have a player in your hands and they just slip right out. And Ole Miss was kind of one of those more slippery offenses. And like you said, Kentucky was dealt a near impossible hand when it comes to their schedule this season. They play a lot of really tough, really talented teams and really powerful offenses back to back. And it'll be interesting to see how this team stands up to the challenge, because missing those first tackles will become the reason they lose in games like Georgia or Texas, or just having offenses that'll take advantage of that.
Yeah, and it was one of the biggest focal points of speaking to players after the Ole Miss game, is the tackles are what hurt them. That's what they attributed to costing some of those explosive plays. And even the big one, the one that even defensive coordinator Brad White talked about changing the entire game, was that 4th and 1 that broke for 55 yards. He said that could have been at most a 30-yard gain and you still had a chance. But all of a sudden it goes for 55, and it just takes the wind out of your sails, because all of a sudden you're having to defend from the 10-yard line instead of the 40. You just don't even give yourself a chance to get off the field without points, without them making a mistake, without them giving you the opportunity to do so with a turnover or something like that. And I think, tackles is going to be a huge way they can maybe limit those explosive plays.
Absolutely.
But so far, even against Toledo, they had their fair share of explosive plays. That's going to be what holds this defense back, if there's anything. And it was an issue dating back to last year as well. Especially against like Florida, where they gave up plenty of yards on the ground and through the air. They just couldn't figure out a way to stop Florida at all.
Yeah, and the same with the Auburn game from I remember. I think what stood out to me the most, last year there was a lot of giving up. And I think it's a culture thing. I think, you can say what you want about maybe it was because of certain players or certain coaches, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It was a culture problem. There's no reason that, play should be given up and there's not players still trying to chase it down. Right. And I think this season it's very different. And yes. I think that's been another one of the highlights of Kentucky is every player I talk to, there's a sense of discipline and energy that I haven't seen before from these players. I think they know the expectations Big Blue Nation is now expecting them to live up to because, it's the first time Kentucky's been in football where people want them to be really good. That used to not be the expectation, but Mark Stoops made that the expectation. That's what it is now. And the players, I think, are starting to realize that there is a pressure on them to succeed because that's what Kentucky fans expect now. And I think they're really living up to that. I think the energy is there. I think there's discipline there. The leadership is there. And that's also been one of the bright spots of Kentucky. But the defense can be amazing, but if they're on the field for a majority of the game, you eventually get beat down, and that's when we kind of talk about another one of the downsides of Kentucky this season, which has been that offense.
Yeah, and all of this comes with the premise of excluding the offensive line and excluding the running game.
Absolutely.
This strictly comes down to quarterback play and just the passing game, which they're all interconnected. Mm-hmm. The bringing in seventh-year man, Zach Calzada, you saw on the tape at Incarnate Board, you saw the arm, you saw just the electric arm, gunning it down the field, just absolute gunslinger, putting up insane numbers. And then all of a sudden he gets here, and it's hard to believe that he
was the same guy.
It's hard to believe it's the same guy. It's hard to believe he's played SEC ball before at a high level. It's hard to believe he's upset Alabama just a few short years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just been a bit of a disconnect, and it really feels like, to me at least, that, can a quarterback change even really fix this at this point? It's starting to look like maybe this is more of kind of like a systematic issue. Because, the biggest thing that stuck out about the Ole Miss loss was even Calzada, you can see him hot-mic'd going like, what the expletive are we doing here? And, obviously they didn't want that to get on television. Yeah. I'm sure it's said by just about every quarterback. But that came at a time where you're coming off a change of possession, where you have over 5 to 6 minutes of real time to get your personnel sorted, to get everything sorted out, and you're subbing people out, and it ends up costing you a timeout because Lane Kiffin on the other sideline takes advantage of it and starts running guys on the field till the play clock runs out, and you have no choice but to call a timeout. And that really, really hurt them in the first half, and then when it came down to it, they have a chance to double dip at the end of the first half and put up points to start the second half, don't have the timeouts.
Yeah, I think, it was a tough situation because Kentucky gets one of the best quarterbacks in the portal last year in Brock Vandegrift. Right. Top 5. He was a top 30 player in the country in the transfer portal. And everyone was like, this is the answer. This is going to be, what brings Kentucky back to that peak Will Levis kind of era. That's what Brock was supposed to be. And then it wasn't. It was, in fact, the direct opposite.
Right.
So, coming into this season when we're getting, an unranked transfer portal player and a player who's really old, a lot of people are questioning it because, there's questions of would it be better to just develop Cutter Bully? Stoops keeps going in and grabbing these older players, which in theory might be better because they're veterans, they have that experience, but it's a 1 or 2 year deal. Right. When you could be developing a player like Cutter off rip and having more time with him as he's, fully grown into what he can be. And this is also just the first year that I feel like there isn't a very clear QB1.
Yeah, I think that Zach off rip was the right decision.
Absolutely.
I think with an unknown wide receiver core, they had several transfers that came in, and you have Jamori Macklin who stayed after, the turnover with Barryon and Dane Key. And then all of a sudden he comes in and it looks like he is a freshman all of a sudden. It looks like there's just not that experience there. So now it's really starting to get to a point where, coming into just a few days after this recording, Eastern Michigan's going to come into town and Cutter Boley is getting the start. But, that's what that's the major talk around town, around the program, is Cutter Boley's going to get the start.
Whether it's from injury or whether it's just because Mark Stoops wanted to change, it doesn't matter.
Right.
We typically don't see this early on in a season.
But you almost feel like it's necessary.
Absolutely. I think there needs to be energy. There needs to be something because have talked about, that defensive side has it. They have that They have, it gets everyone rowdy in Kroger Field. They have that. But when the offense is on the field, it's like crickets, right? Because you're just not seeing anything. The run game's been absolutely incredible, but what's going to make a crowd go crazy? A 40-yard dart down the field. But, when you have a wide receiver room, 18 players now, and they're all young or transfers, and you're kind of stuck with, you got Macklin who's returning, but the rest you're like, we don't really know. And that's kind of the problem, I think, with the transfer portal too, is like, there's a brand new transfer quarterback, and then we have all brand new transfer wide receivers. How are we going to get them to connect? And with Kentucky, the unfortunate reality was they had to play a top-ranked SEC team week 2. So they didn't have as much time as maybe, they would have had in years past, when they would have played 3 easier games to start off the season instead of going straight into Ole Miss. But it's very interesting, and I think that's what's concerning Kentucky fans the most, and concerning me the most, is we still don't have a clear QB1. We still don't really know what the best choice is. And when, you have, like you were saying, one of the best transfers in the country last season getting sent to retirement because of, whatever reason, but ending his career at Kentucky after a very unsuccessful season, it's a question of, does it go beyond the talent? Is there something internally that maybe the quarterbacks aren't being set up for success?
Right, and that's kind of the thing is, with the defense, it almost seems like there is an answer. The defense can limit the explosive plays if they make that first tackle, connect on that first contact.
You know what to work on.
Right. Maybe get a little bit, tighter with their coverages and things like that. But it just seems like with this offense, it's still just a mystery. Speaking to Bush Hamdan this past Tuesday, leading into the Eastern Michigan game, he was very confident that it can get back on track. He's mentioned Kendrick Law, a transfer from Alabama, who is just an electric player. And, we've seen the ball in his hands a little bit, and it's looked good. He has looked good. And I think that can be the true wide receiver 1 out of this group. But it just still feels like there's just a bit of a disconnect all across the board with this passing game. And you almost start to wonder if the finger is time to point it at Bush Hamdan in just his second year here.
Yeah, I think, and, we talk about, Calzada brought it up too, that, it's a little bit confusing almost, because in camp all summer, he was working really well with the wide receivers. He talked about all the time. We saw it, on tape, that he was finding those connections. Calzada was. Yeah. And it seems like when he steps out there in the real game, he has no idea what's going on. He seems very confused. But at the same time, him being confused, is that a product of Bush not being able to be clear about his calls or whatnot? There's a lot of questions, which is the concerning part. Because like you were saying, there are clear answers to what needs to be fixed on the defense. On the offense, it's easier to point out what's correct than it is to point out what needs to be changed.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that they could do on the offense is just limit those procedural issues, limit those kinds of things that are going to cost you timeouts. So that way, when you have the opportunity to go put up 6, 2 field goals, or even 10, 14 points on an SEC team by just playing keep away, just keeping those possessions in the half with a score, starting the second half with a score. Those are huge moments in any game. Most of the time, it's a common saying in football that the last 2 minutes of the first half and the first 2 minutes, the first drive of the second half can win or lose you the game.
Absolutely.
And it's just that simple. You look at this one, going into half, it was right there. It was right there for Kentucky. And then even literally, it wasn't a 2-possession game until the last minute of the game. Mm-hmm. And so it's just one of those things where, you come away head scratching from a game like Ole Miss, where they had just every chance under the sun. There. You had every chance under the sun. And the one deep connection that they had was to Macklin. And he's lucky that Macklin kind of dusted the corner by so much, because it was right there. And if it was a jump ball, it was underthrown. So it could have easily been a pick. And those are the kinds of things that just cannot happen. You have to be able to hit on those deep passes, those explosive plays, like we talked about with the defense. Kentucky is near the bottom of the nation in giving them up, and they're near the bottom of the nation in getting them. And that's a huge problem, because part of being an SEC offense is you're going to play ones that are a lot more high-powered than you. And if you can't connect on a couple that can really sway the game in your favor, then there's really just no light at the end of this tunnel for the schedule of Kentucky. They're not going to be able to just run the game 40 times a game and win in the SEC.
Yeah, that's, going into exactly what I was going to talk about is, even if there were really key things to fix about this offense, we know it would be a long list.
Yes.
And the truth is there is not time. As much as, we can pretend, if there was a couple more, there isn't, right? You play Eastern Michigan and you get a bye. I think Kentucky got very lucky with that scheduling.
Yeah, that's going to be crucial for them because it gives them a little bit more time to maybe try to find some connections against a lower level opponent in Eastern Michigan, and then kind of reflect on the past 3 weeks of who's going to play quarterback, what's going to happen, and then make some real decisions from there, because it gets really tough after that, and those kinds of things have to be sorted before you can go on the road and play a game, ranked South Carolina team.
I was going to say, after South Carolina, as of right now, ranked 11 South Carolina, and then the next week you go to Georgia, number 6 Georgia, and then you host number 7 Texas, and then you host number 15 Tennessee, and then you go play at Auburn. They're 24 right now, but as we know, rank doesn't matter. Jordan-Hare is an evil place to play. There just isn't time, and that's, what I think we'll start seeing across college football is, when teams are getting all these super great transfers, we got this new, we got five stars in the transfer portal or whatnot. Do you have enough time to make them work together? Yeah. And I think Kentucky bringing in 53 new players, they're becoming a prime example of that, where we think they have, the players to make this team good and make this team succeed. It feels like they have just run out of time to make it work, and unfortunately for them, when you have that gauntlet of a schedule, there's not much room for failure. There's not much room for, those missed tackles. And there's definitely not room to not have an option down the field to throw the ball to, because, it's tough. You're potentially playing like 3 or 4 teams that are expected to be in playoff contention.
Yeah, and it just leaves little room for error and little light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to this passing game. But who knows? Maybe a quarterback change is the answer. Only time will tell with the goods and the bads of this team and how it's going to shake out for the rest of the year. Because while something looks good now, while something looks bad now, there's a lot of football left to be played for Kentucky in 2025.
Yeah, I think, this team wants it a lot. I think, you can tell that when we talk to players across the board, offense, defense, anyone, the want is there. And honestly, I feel like the team last year didn't have that.
No, it felt very lifeless.
It felt lifeless and selfish. I think some players were ready to either move on to the next level or ready to get out of Kentucky and go to somewhere else. I think this year, all these players are very proud to wear Kentucky across their chest, and they want to give Big Blue Nation the satisfaction of Kentucky football the way they had it in 2021 and 2018 under Mark Stoops. And, Mark Stoops is starting to get a little bit of a warmer seat if he doesn't succeed again, and which, once again, it's unfortunate for him with this schedule, because even with one of the best teams in the country, you're going to struggle. Yeah. Anyone would struggle with this schedule. It doesn't matter who it is. But, you start thinking about Mark Stoops and, if we're getting all of this talent in the portal, is it the players or lack of talent that's not bringing us to success, or is it something internally? Is it something from the coaches? So it'll be interesting to see. I think we both kind of expect Eastern Michigan to be a pretty easy game, and hopefully one where Kentucky can finally get its first passing touchdown of the season. But, heading into South Carolina, it's really going to be the question of, is there a chance, for a bowl?
Right, and that's going to kind of be the determining factor, but only time will tell as 2025 rolls on. We want to thank you all for watching the inaugural edition of the Pigskin Podcast. We hope you are enjoying all the stories you can find in the special section. If you found this on YouTube and go to the University of Kentucky or live in Lexington, feel free to go to the several newspaper racks located all over campus and pick yourself up one today. But if you are either not in Lexington or anywhere around the world, you can head over to kykernel.com for all of our coverage of UK athletics, or follow along for live game updates for the rest of this Kentucky football season, basketball season, you name it. We'll have it over on KY Kernel Sports on Twitter or X. Until next time, thanks for watching.